One of the biggest strengths of the Mario Maker games is their ability to provide a huge plethora of entertaining platforming concepts without sacrificing anything to get there. This is possible because of the community-driven nature of the games. It doesn't particularly matter if the developers are struggling to come up with new or innovative levels, because the players are doing that for them, and in many cases, doing it better than them. Nintendo's popularity and size also add to the volume of levels submitted, farther strengthening the concept in a way only achievable on a AAA budget. The Mario Makers aren't my favorite Mario games by any stretch, not particularly close, but it would be foolish of me to not give credit where credit is due. If we look at it through the perspective of result achieved against effort expended, it might be one of the most profitable and successful games of all time. All the developers had to do was create the tools, and let everyone else do the rest. However, the Mario Maker series has created a problem for Nintendo. Because of the nature of these games, it's become impossible for the developers of future Mario titles to use the basic Mario elements in a way that has not been seen before. Statistically speaking, it's probable that nearly any possible design a developer could come up with has already been conceived by a fan, and maybe even more aptly executed as well. Looking at it this way, it becomes clear that making a new Mario game which only remixed the basic pieces of the series wouldn't cut it. It's through this lens that we can see Super Mario Bros. Wonder as the radical departure from tradition that it needed to be. Mario Wonder is designed from the ground up to be as unique as possible. It seems that nearly every aspect of the game was at least considered for a change or revamp. The most obvious way this uniqueness shows itself is in the various effects of the Wonder Flower, this game's signature power-up. When touched, the Wonder Flower has a unique, standalone effect that changes something about the level, the rules of the mechanics, or even Mario himself. While some of these effects do get reused, many are implemented only a single time, which adds to the variety on offer. Of course, this system has a drawback. Because of the various, ever-changing natures of the flower, each individual implementation throughout the game has to be conceptualized, designed, and coded separately. If your game has a power-up that is central to the design, you can simply drag and drop it however you so choose, to put it crudely. As long as the base architecture of your mechanic is sound, it can be used comfortably in many different situations with minimal additional effort. Here, anytime a new Wonder effect was conceived, it had to be written from scratch, like going about making an entirely new power-up. Fortunately, this problem hasn't made it past the theoretical stage. Each flower is pulled off effortlessly, with nary a hint of lazy coding or cut corners. Many of the effects are fairly complicated, and probably took a heap of effort to get correct. Because of the funding provided, and surely an enormous amount of time and work, each of the flowers end up being well implemented into the levels, something that would have been much harder for a smaller studio. One of the biggest advantages of the system the designers decided to go with is the massively non-committal nature of the mechanic. Each individual flower is specifically designed with a gameplay section or level in mind, and then formulated to provide a great experience without worry of system boundaries to restrict this development. Wonder Flowers as a quote-unquote mechanic are actually a collection of many disparate mechanics. As opposed to other games and mechanics in Mario's past, the flower doesn't exist to fill a certain niche or to prop up any specific elements of design. It fills all niches and can be used to prop up any design. Suppose you were creating a game with a specific ability in mind, a power-up that's central to most challenges. While it's absolutely possible to create a massive number of different, engaging scenarios with any given effect, it's also unquestionably restrictive. Introducing an effect beyond what the player has gotten used to will take time to explain its mechanics, and may not naturally fit into the design as is. The Wonder Flower sidesteps this with its ever-changing nature. Over the course of the game, the player will learn to stop expecting anything in particular from these effects. Additionally, every effect in Wonder, especially the ones that affect Mario's form, are both simple and intuitive, and can be understood nearly completely with only a few seconds behind the wheel. These two things combine together to synthesize a mechanic that can be added into levels without much fuss. It's the perfect excuse to make any radical change you can conceive into reality, and it shows, with how often Wonder Flowers ended up pushing existing elements of stages over the top. Each of the effects of the flower don't even necessarily improve upon the base gameplay. It would be absolutely fair to say that many of their various effects are actually less mechanically deep than the usual systems. A good example would be the flower that changes the perspective of the scene, such that Mario is now walking on the background walls of the scenery rather than the floor. While in this state, Mario can't jump or fall. meaning that this Wonder Flowers mechanic changes the rules of play towards a more shallow moveset, with limits on the player's abilities as compared to the standard controls. This might sound like a poor design choice at first, and while I would agree that these sections aren't quite as mechanically engaging as regular play, they hold up better than they otherwise might because of their uniqueness and optionality. Even if the movement in these parts isn't as well constructed as others, it provides a sort of temporary excursion into something different, which can do a lot to improve the overall experience of play, even if that diversion isn't as good as the standard gameplay. Not to mention, a large portion of the flowers aren't required to beat a level, and can be skipped if a player is replaying it. For the most part, if a Wonder Flower is mandatory for completing a level, that level was designed around the flower, not the other way around, meaning that the effect is generally better implemented into the encounter. For many regular stages, the stage and the flower are fairly separated in terms of their effects. You play through the stage, do the flower event when you come across it, which usually involves temporarily changing the scenery and the rules, and when you're done, you go back to completing the level under the normal rules of play. A player needn't interact with the Wonder Flower on repeat runs through the level if they felt it wasn't engaging, or that it would have been best on their first experience of it. The Wonder Flowers were also a good excuse for the developers to bring back some classic Mario favorites. The Balloon power-up and Metal Mario both return in this way. This is possible because of the way the flowers are coded. The one-off nature of the flowers means that these callbacks can fit nicely into the rest of the game, without too much hassle or commitment. The online, cooperative multiplayer is another area that is entirely new territory for the series, where you will be matched with 3 other players that you can complete the level with. You might be expecting that this would work like the local multiplayer in previous Mario games, but the online in Mario Wonder is actually very similar to the offline play in many ways. Unlike how the series has handled player interaction before, everyone will pass right through each other when they touch, which previously would have resulted in a collision. Because you can't directly interact with other players, it can sometimes feel more like a solo journey similar to the single player, rather than a cooperative adventure. Each player's game runs a separate local instance of the level, where everything works as you would expect if you were playing alone. Players can never help each other deal with a threat or remove obstacles, as any change to the game only happens client-side. This is added to by the ability to run away from other players and leave them behind, whereas in local play, the players must all be on the screen at the same time. While it might seem a bit bizarre that the developers would go this route, the reason for these changes is obvious when you think about another relevant element of design, the Wonder Flower. It's the simple reality of the situation that the kind of multiplayer found in the series past was completely incompatible with how the flower can affect the game. For many to function, players would need to be tied together at the hip so the flower would affect everyone at the same time, which isn't ideal in an online scenario with very little in the way of communication. Even then, many would break when players disrupted each other by bumping and jostling for position. It's not that the developers wanted to make this change, they were forced to, which is unfortunate considering the benefits of the previous system. Having players all together on the same screen and interacting helps provide a sense of cooperative exploration. It trends towards a more player interactive experience, where some level of communication and coordination is necessary for the game to be played effectively. Even with the current mechanics essentially being forced on the designers, it isn't all negative. I think there are actually 2 major points in favor of the newly implemented system as compared to the old one. The first matters in terms of how players can affect another's experience. Because a player can't interact with anything from another player's client, they are able to do everything in that stage with no interference from anyone else. If changes to the game state impacted every player instead of only the one who caused it, players would be able to destroy obstacles globally. Having this be the case would mean that it would be possible, and even common, for the worst player in the lobby to have the way completely cleared for them by the combined efforts of the 3 other players, whether on purpose or not. Not to mention, many 10-flower coins would be collected without the other players even understanding how it was achieved. This seems like an undesirable outcome, where a player could miss out on a significant portion of the content available in any given level if they aren't there to perform or witness it, which is all but certain in most scenarios. All of this contributes to the second reason, being that there is now no possibility of a player taking a course of action that could directly or indirectly harm someone else. Being able to block other players is an okay mechanic when playing local, but online, with almost no way to strategize, it would be much more annoying, where a player can take damage or even fall into a pit because another player happened to be standing in the wrong position. Blocks could be broken out from under players' feet, items could be thrown directly at others, enemies like the rhinos or wind-up rollers could be aggroed into unsuspecting players, balancing pipes could be moved into extremely unfavorable positions, and many other unfortunate things could happen if every player's decisions and game state were superimposed. All in all, the way the online multiplayer is set up compared to former systems reduces uncertainty in many ways. Playing with others now feels less chaotic than it did in the multiplayers of previous entries in the series, which can be a blessing, if a bit drier. Speaking of drier gameplay, local multiplayer makes a return as well. Players can no longer directly interact, like the online, and will phase right through each other. Because of this, as well as the differences in the grabbing and throwing mechanics, it is also impossible to pick up another player, a la New Super Mario Bros. It seems that these changes were put in place to make the local co-op line up with the mechanics of the online multiplayer. As you can't interact with anyone while playing online, it makes sense the developers would want to make this consistent across all forms of multiplayer content, both to keep players familiar with how the game's mechanics work in multiplayer, and to avoid extra development and testing solely for local play. These changes made have the effect of making the game far less chaotic. Your momentum is no longer interrupted by unexpectedly running into another player, which keeps the movement feeling smooth and responsive. Being able to pick up others also lets you directly attack each other by throwing your teammates into harm's way, which ups the chaos considerably. This was removed in Wonder. While this could be seen as a bit of a lame change by some, considering it puts a sizable damper on the amount of shenanigans you can get up to with friends and family, I'm not sure that this is the kind of game that is improved by these sorts of antics. While I myself vastly prefer the former system because of the mischief that can be achieved, I would have to admit that this is probably a step in the right direction. Having the ability to purposefully mess with each other like before doesn't seem like something the developers want to be encouraging, considering the cooperative nature of the multiplayer, the family-oriented gameplay, and the carefree theming. I'm also aware of another thing that can only be done while playing online with friends, the races. At the start of a level, players can activate a block that starts the challenge, where players have to race across the level to make it to the end before their friends. I can't comment on this, however, as I haven't been able to play with anyone I know. Elephant Mario is the first power-up introduced in this game, and gives the player two new abilities. Mario can swing his trunk to take out enemies and blocks in front of him, something that can come in handy in a variety of ways. Oftentimes, secrets will be hidden behind bricks, with the player needing the elephant power-up to make their way through. Mario's trunk can also hold water if the player passes by a fountain or puddle, and can be used to water plants and cool hot rocks that will otherwise damage the player. Mario's new bulky form also lets him push pipes faster and run across 2-block-wide gaps, but these two features of the power-up come up much less frequently than the two main ones. This set of abilities might not seem to fit on the same power-up, in terms of gameplay only, of course. Being able to break blocks in front of you and spray water are two completely different abilities that have almost nothing to do with each other. This is a pretty clear case of top-down design, where it seems the developers came up with the visual idea of an elephant transformation for Mario, and later came up with the elephant-flavored mechanics to go along with it. Looking at the other new power-ups introduced in Wonder, it feels like this was the case with all three, which, to be clear, isn't necessarily bad. The trio are all well implemented into the levels and other areas of design, and this sort of aesthetics first, mechanics second approach has helped to introduce some otherwise very unorthodox designs into the game, with all three being extremely memorable inclusions. Levels with the elephant power-up are often designed to have obstacles that are much more easily dealt with in elephant form. Breaking blocks with your trunk can reveal secret areas or make traveling along the main path easier, or can be used to access 10 flower coins blocked off by bricks. Stages are also more likely to include Koopas and other shelled enemies throughout if they feature the elephant, because of how the trunk smack lets you knock them up into the air. Although more rare, some stages also include 2-block-wide gaps over some of the pits, for which the elephant can come in handy. The best uses of the water mechanic come in World 6, where these lava rocks that are on a timer to burn the player can be completely turned off with a spray of some water, incentivizing the player to keep their power-up as long as possible, as the trunk is a far more convenient form of hydration than the various water pits often scattered throughout. The bubble suit is the second introduced, with the power to blow bubbles that can be used in a variety of situations. It's very different from the elephant in the sense of what kinds of tools it gives the player. The elephant power-up gives the player a handful of new abilities and benefits that are useful in very specific scenarios, whereas the bubble power-up gives the player a single tool that can be broadly applied to a wide variety of situations. It can be used to defeat enemies, grab items through walls, and even as makeshift platforms. The bounce that can be done off these bubbles is itself very flexible and free-form, and can be used by a skilled player to do many neat things. Another great decision regarding the bubble is how it disappears after being touched. This means the player has to be careful and plan ahead when deciding to use them as platforms, adding to the ways it allows the player to express their skill in a very large manner. Levels that incorporate the bubble suit are less likely than the elephant ones to include specific scenarios that require the use of its ability. This type of design manifests the greatest in flowers tucked away behind walls that can only be collected by blowing your blobs at them. But other than this, these levels seem far more content with pushing content that can exist separately from the power-up. My best guess as to why this is has to do with how broad the bubble is as an ability. As it can be applied pretty generically as a helper in many different situations, it seems harder to design around than an upgrade where each of its parts are formulated as fixes to specific problems. To be clear, I don't think that these levels are poorly designed in this way, just that the bubble suit often functions as a generically good power-up like the fire flower. It enhances Mario in ways that are hard to apply to level design other than more efficient offensive capabilities. The drill suit is the third and final new power-up added to the player's arsenal, and, like the elephant, has a wide range of different features. However, these effects are often useful in many different ways, like the bubble flower. These two effects combine to make a power-up that has a large amount of flexible tools that can be used to engage with different challenges in varied and meaningful ways. A winning combination that excellently extends the skill ceiling and proves to be an interesting tool to learn and master. With the drill, the player can burrow into the ground, which can be used to avoid enemies and environmental threats, bypass obstacles, and sneak into terrain designed specifically for the drill to gain access to. This is extended with the ability to drill into the ceiling, which can prove handy to avoid danger, as well as explore otherwise unreachable areas. Jumping causes the drill on your hat to spin, taking out threats falling towards you from above, as well as swiftly breaking vulnerable terrain above you. Mario's offensive capabilities are also expanded, with his ground pound being modified to have some additional punch against armored enemies. Like the elephant, levels that incorporate the suit tend to feature areas that are gatekept by the requirement of having it. This most often manifests itself in the form of cracks in the floor that the player can slip through only while submerged. Another commonality of these stages is enemies that are impervious to normal attacks, but can be dealt with by the drilling. Spinies are present in a good amount of drill levels, and a foe new to this title, these rock roller enemies, make an appearance in the 6th world. Oftentimes, stages will combine the mobility advantages of the drill with the combat benefits to add additional challenge or increase the complexity of the situation. For these reasons, I believe the drill suit to be the power-up that is best implemented into the game as a whole. Considering all its abilities, which add both mechanical and strategic depth, and how levels are designed to take advantage of it to the fullest, it's a strong contender for a spot amongst the most well-implemented power-ups in series history, and a personal favorite of mine. While most of the new inclusions here are well-designed, the badge system has some good and some bad. I was a bit skeptical of Mario Wonder's badges before the game came out. I was unsure if this would actually benefit the gameplay as opposed to needlessly complicating what's been the basic design principles of the series. Badges remain my biggest gripe with the game as a whole, but there are some good things to talk about. First, we should run through what they actually do. Badges are another way the game innovates on the standard formula of the series. While progressing through the game, Mario will gain access to a variety of different ones that can be equipped. There are 3 different types, each with different rules for how they affect the player. Action badges give the player some ability that affects how they may choose to move through the world. Boost badges add a passive benefit that can give an advantage without having to worry about how it affects your play. Expert badges come with a downside, but include gameplay mechanics that are significantly more extreme than the standard options. With only one badge being able to be used at a time, this exists as a toolset option, which is the first time in the series that players have had a level of control over their moveset besides which character they may choose to play. Looking at how this positively benefits the game, there are several things you could point to justify their inclusion. They extend the player's control over their character, which is utilized the greatest in the badge challenge levels. Badge challenges are themselves excellent inclusions. Having gameplay focus solely around a specific move in your arsenal means the developers can craft the experience in a much more controlled way, with obstacles that are intuitive to understand, fair to take on, and satisfying to overcome, the holy trinity of crafting a well-paced stage. Additionally, badges can serve as a way for the player to show a greater mastery of the mechanics. Additional moves means a greater skill ceiling, and experienced players will take this as an opportunity to improve their understanding and utilization of their full toolset. The expert badges are great at this. While not optimal picks, they serve as a built-in way for players to do challenge runs with specific limiters in place. Not being able to stop running, or stop jumping, or even see where you are all fantastic features that allow good players to test themselves farther. However, there are some number of problems as well. One of the biggest issues with the badges are their power levels. While they do add some amount of player choice of toolset, I would say that only around half of the badges are actually worth equipping. That's including badges like the Spring Jump badge, which isn't optimal by any means, but can provide interesting challenge run potential. For the rest of the duds, it's hard to see why anyone would choose them when there exist several other options that are more versatile or stronger at performing the same job. The biggest offender in this regard is the Grapple Vine badge. With it, the player can grab onto terrain from afar and pull themselves to the surface, then hang there for a couple seconds. This sounds pretty powerful, and it is, but that isn't all. If a player jumps after using the vine, they can turn around and grapple to the same wall again, allowing the player to hang from the same wall indefinitely, and even gain height up its surface. This feature means that the vine outperforms the wall jump badge at scaling walls, the safety bounce badge at saving the player from a fall, and nearly any ability badge at gaining height while the player is next to a wall. And does all this while providing a massive amount of flexibility and adaptability to Mario's toolkit. This means that, when taking the unique layouts of each level into account, this badge is likely going to be one of the most optimal choices for most of the stages on offer, which can disincentivize picking any of the others. Compounding this is the lack of differing gameplay implications of the other badges. This exists as a problem of its own, but is also heavily tied into the issues with the Vine badge. Let's look at all the badges with a critical eye. What reason would a player have for picking the High Jump badge, for example? I'm not asking how it would benefit the player, but more so how it distinguishes itself from the other options available. It doesn't come associated with a significant gimmick that the player can learn to play with. A good example of what I'm talking about is the Spring badge. I've already brought it up before, because it's among the most well-crafted badges in the game. While it isn't the most powerful, it provides a unique experience and implication that the player will need to take into account when using it. Apply this metric to the High Jump badge. Are there any reasons someone might be attracted to it? Any gameplay implications that separate the High Jump badge from its competition, as opposed to the Charge Jump badge? The Consecutive Jump badge? This is an issue with some of Mario Wonder's action badges, and a majority of the boost badges. They aren't significantly different enough from their competition to warrant a player picking them for playstyle purposes. Boiled down, most action badges basically give Mario extra height, extra distance, or usually both. The best in this regard, not counting the expert badges or the Grapple Vine badge, are the Wall Jump badge and the Parachute badge, as they come with some amount of gameplay ramification. But even these don't offer a huge amount of difference compared to the rest of the crowd. The boost badges are even worse in this regard, offering no additions to the control you have over your character in exchange for a passive, usually negligible benefit. This leads into another badge issue, that being the Sensor badge. With this equipped, the player will be alerted to the presence of secrets in their vicinity. Although I don't think that this badge is very powerful, I believe it represents a new, undesirable outlook for the series on how hidden collectibles ought to be treated. It seems that this was designed out of some level of thought for less experienced players, and while I understand this concern, I think that it's very important for the player to discover these things through their own ingenuity, and not because they were told where to look. This isn't the biggest problem in the world, as it just tells people that they are near something, and not where that thing is or how to overcome or solve it. However, I don't think that a player has the right to find every hidden achievement without putting in the effort to do so. I worry that this could damage the enjoyability of the collecting experience for some players who decide to take the easy way out instead of working at it and finding the hidden secrets of their own accord. It's also worth noting that various badges can make reaching the top of the flagpole a bit too easy. The Parachute Cap and Spin Jump badges in particular can make grabbing the tops of most of the level end poles very effortless. I don't think that the top of the flagpole should be an especially difficult challenge to overcome, but it's absolutely arguable that some badges make it comically easy to do so, which defeats the purpose of such a challenge to begin with. It sort of feels like the platforms and ramps leading up to most flagpoles were designed to be easily clearable without taking badges into account whatsoever. I certainly understand that you don't want to prevent players from reaching the top just because they happen to have the wrong badge equipped, but these challenges are far too lenient in how they handle this issue. I understand that you might take this all to mean that the badges aren't a very well implemented part of the game, and while I think they are probably Wonder's weakest element, I don't believe the system to be bad wholesale. There's some good ideas here, and at the very least, they do inject some amount of variety that has been taken out by each character having the same abilities. Badge challenges could be taken to justify the system's inclusion completely, given how good they are as levels in their own right, but it's unfortunate that these great stages are facilitated by an unpolished mechanic. Potentially, I could see badges being improved upon greatly with some power level tweaking and greater variance, so it will be interesting to see if Nintendo carries this forward into future games. There are also a grand total of 12 different characters, by far the largest playable cast of any Mario game so far. As opposed to previous games with character choices, such as Super Mario 3D World, 7 of the options have identical gameplay, with the standard movement you would expect from the series. In previous games, the characters each have different attributes that can minorly contribute towards different playstyles. On one hand, it's a shame that this choice is now removed, but on the other, it's good that a player can pick the character they like most without feeling disappointed that another has a better ability. The other 5 are 4 different colors of Yoshi and Nabbit. Like the badges, I was a bit worried before the game came out that Nabbit and the Yoshis would be a bit too strong. They're different from the rest of the cast in that they can't take damage. When colliding with an enemy, they simply bounce backwards, which is useful for players that run into damage frequently. This is obviously an inclusion for less experienced players, and I don't fault the developers for catering more towards beginners. I was worrying because I had a suspicion that these characters would be too powerful in more capable hands, Yoshi especially. The Yoshis have a flutter jump and a tongue grab as well, the first of which drastically improves the player's jumping ability, and the second of which improves the player's offensive capabilities. Fortunately, my worries turned out to be unfounded. In practice, the limitation of not being able to use power-ups is much larger than it might seem. You might expect that the abilities offered by these characters, the Yoshis in particular, outclass even the best power-ups, but there is a major reason this design decision works better than it might have: the limits on grabbing collectibles. Oftentimes, the player hugely benefits by having some power-up in accessing an area that contains a collectible, like a 10-flower coin or a Wonder Flower. Because these characters can't access the abilities power-ups provide, it can be much harder to effectively reach these areas. Yoshi is better than Nabbit at this, but even he can't compete with some of the movement available for powers present with the drill and bubble suit. In general gameplay as well, the power-ups end up lending a much bigger hand than you might expect, which decreases the power difference farther. All in all, this is an effective way to balance such an advantage. In my Mario World analysis, I said that less experienced players aren't going to be able to take advantage of the power-up's abilities in the same way a good player would because taking damage removes it. This is improved here, with an inexperienced person being able to pick a character that has power-up abilities built in, essentially. At the same time, these characters aren't as strong as regular characters with an actual power-up. Higher floor, lower ceiling. This is a fantastic way to provide a smoother experience to children and other beginners without lowering the skill ceiling for veterans, and the sort of change that the series has been wanting very much for a long time. Wonder has many things added to it that are series firsts, but we also shouldn't ignore some of the first-time exclusions as well. As a 2D Mario first, there is no time limit on regular levels. There are many smaller side levels which feature a clock or some countdown, and some that are set when a player activates a Wonder Flower, but none of the standard stages have a timer as a basic feature. It feels a little strange to have removed this after 38 years worth of 2D games with it, but I think that this decision is a well-reasoned one because of a couple factors. The first is a lack of meaningful pressure on the player. Because these games' target demographic is young, the developers had to be careful not to make the time limits too strict. If a beginner player was struggling to make it to the end in time because the clock was too demanding, it could lead to undesirable frustration. The problem arises when less novice players are thrown into the mix. It's a simple fact of these types of platforming games that better players will complete their goal faster than worse ones. Balancing the limits around the skills of amateur players means that they can seem somewhat arbitrary to an experienced platformer. The lack of any realistic consequence for playing even substantially sloppier than usual can render the challenge intention intended null. Removing it has taken out this redundant aspect of design for better players, and has had no negative effect on players of a lesser caliber. The second is a difference in how this game presents its collectibles. Wonder has more collectibles and mid-stage objectives than ever before, with the flowers being added in addition to the big coins. If there was a timer, it would be even harder for the developers to decide what time limit the level should have, as there is now a greater variety of possible times that they could realistically expect players to grab everything. Sometimes, the gameplay of the new Wonder Flower sections have timers of their own, which already serve the purpose of motivating the player forward, and would be redundant if used in combination with a more universal clock. For these reasons, neglecting to add a timer for standard levels was a wise decision. Speaking of series constants that are missing this time around, no points. If you've seen my Super Mario World analysis, you know how I feel about the point systems in Mario games. To recap, points have always had a hard time meshing with the series. They exist to reward certain actions, like stomping enemies, but the actions that will give the most points are not necessarily the most optimal set of actions the player can take. This can lead to a player going out of their way to do things that will yield points which are useless and a poor indicator of player skill, which I would argue is detrimental to the game's presentation in a broad sense. It feels good to see this band-aid being ripped off. I think that the series will be healthier with points gone from the equation. Obviously, there was some utility to the points system that shouldn't be denied. Giving the player an increasing amount of points for each consecutive bounce off an enemy was a decent way to reward an understanding and competence with the controls. However, I think that this role is better filled by the replacement system present in Wonder. Instead of points, consecutive actions will display a congratulatory word, such as super or excellent. These words' importance increase in value until the last one in the string, wonderful. I believe that this works better as a reward for type play than points, because it functions purely intrinsically. Points introduce a sort of yearning for an increasing number, the sort of motivation present in many gacha games, which can mislead and manipulate the player into gameplay strategies that will facilitate increasing this number, even if it serves no purpose. I couldn't tell you how many times I've gone out of my way to grab a power-up that I already have in previous Mario titles, even though I know it's absolutely pointless. Changing the system in this way is positive because it rewards players not with misguidance, but with aesthetic pleasure, same as the flagpole sound or fireworks. One of my favorite little design touches present in 3D World is the inability to exit a level if the player is in midair. Standing on the ground is a necessity to be able to quit out of a level. This might seem arbitrary at first, but it's an important decision to regulate the player's ability to avoid a punishment for failure. If you launch yourself off a platform carelessly, you don't get to skip out on the consequences of your actions. Each game in the series that features the ability to exit a level early has some sort of limitation which prevents abuse. 3D World has its ground limitation, which prevents a player from saving themselves from the consequences of a fall. Mario Odyssey has something similar, where a player is only allowed to teleport to checkpoint flags if they are standing on solid ground. Mario World has a previously completed limitation, where a player has to have finished the level before they are allowed to exit on subsequent runs through it. Although these systems all function differently, they all serve the same purpose: to limit the player in an attempt to prevent abuse of the leave level feature. Mario Wonder has none of these. A player is free to quit out at any point, even right before falling into a pit or running into an enemy. This feels like a solved issue, especially since there are several variations of fixes for this throughout the series. The developers had their pick of a couple solutions, and neither made it into the final product. With how much consideration this game has for even tiny details, it's very likely that the developers decided this sort of mechanic wasn't necessary. Granted, the player still loses any power-ups, Wonder Seeds, and 10 flower coins they may have collected up to that point. However, if a player has gotten any of these, they know how to get them again, lessening the effort significantly, and decreasing the effectiveness of the system at disincentivizing the player from quitting out of any misfortune. Another change to the collectibles is the ways they are placed. In previous games, especially the new Super Mario Bros series, collectibles were frequently hidden behind fake walls, ceilings, and floors. It was very common to find secret rooms by pressing up against these surfaces. While this design type might seem to reward exploration on paper, it can be a bit poor in practice, because it can often be very difficult to determine which surfaces are hiding secrets without checking. It can seem unfair when a surface turns out to be hiding some secret room with almost no way to tell beforehand. With this kind of thinking, a player may choose to check any and all surfaces that seem even slightly suspicious, which can damage the pace of gameplay significantly. In Mario Wonder, these sorts of invisible walls are non-existent. Most of the 10 flower coins and Wonder Seeds are visible immediately, where the challenge is instead to figure out how to reach it. Some aren't, but are otherwise obviously present to a player paying attention to their surroundings, such as a Wonder Seed hidden in blocks, which gives off a particle effect alerting players to its presence. Others are tucked away in sub-areas or out of sight, but can be discovered by noticing pipes or gaps that seem to be out of place. By removing invisible walls that hide treasure, the developers have affected the pacing and fairness of Wonder positively. The only place this kind of invisible secret remains is in the use of Kaizo blocks. These hidden blocks that are revealed by jumping into them from below have been in use since the very first Mario title. For the most part, they aren't nearly as damaging to the game as something like an illusory wall, because the secrets they contain are often far less important to the player, such as coins or a power-up, than something like a full-blown collectible. It's also notable that they feature prominently in Wonder's search party levels, small stages where the player has to search for 5 hidden coins to unlock a Wonder Seed. These are utilized far better here than they are in standard play, because players are expecting their presence, which removes the unfair aspects that would otherwise be normal. Warps are also missing from the overall equation. In the past, the 2D games have always had a way for the player to skip some amount of the game's levels. The cannons in New Super Mario Bros. For the DS are a good example, allowing the player to skip directly ahead past a whole world, which saves a massive amount of time completing the game. Even discounting highly optimized speedruns, most every game in the 2D series past was possible to complete in less than an hour with some know-how and experience. Wonder bucks this trend, with a complete absence of warps, a decision that I believe to be a wise one overall. Although it can be fun to find a warp and skip a chunk of the game, I'm not sure that this process is for the best. Having a player not be able to miss a world or 3 means that the experience can be more tightly controlled, where the designers can assume that every player will have needed to go through certain levels to make it to another, opening up design possibilities not feasible in previous titles. Wonder in particular is well suited to take this change, being that a player needn't complete every stage in a world to move past it, meaning warps lose exclusivity on the advantage of being able to diversify the experience for players interested. Besides the many twists and innovations that have been applied, there has also been some amount of streamlining. One of the biggest examples of this is the navigation menu. This displays all the levels the player has found, as well as the collectibles that have already been acquired for each. If everything has been achieved, a check appears over the display. Do this for every stage in a section, and the whole world is marked as complete. The player can even travel to any level in the game with just a press of a button. These designs are implemented for convenience, and can prove very helpful throughout any playthrough. It reduces the amount of retracing your steps you have to do, and generally increases the amount of time the player will spend actually playing a level. It also indicates to a player that there is unfinished business present in any given stage, so a player looking to play to 100% completion will have an easy way to see what's left to tackle. Boss fights have always tended towards being some of the weaker elements of the 2D Mario series. The reasons for this are straightforward, with the most obvious one being a general lack of challenge. Oftentimes, the enemy's attacks are very easy to predict and avoid, with few difficult hurdles to overcome. These fights are also very mechanically shallow. Bosses tend to have only a handful of different movements and attacks to threaten the player with, and some only have a single move that they repeat over and over again. Even though these fights tend to not be very long, these factors can lead to player boredom very quickly, especially when fights are repeated several times throughout the game with little variation. The encounters with Bowser Jr. in Mario Wonder have some notable improvements over the standard formula. While the basic mechanics and strategy of the fights is the same as in previous games, with Jr. having to be jumped on top of, and then spinning on the ground after in retaliation, extra layers have been added on top to help make these fights more engaging. The most common way this is done is with a changing environment. Water can fill the screen to slow the player's movements, different height platforms can be available, and the ground can become like mud, among other effects. Growing and shrinking in size, and making clones are some of the ways that these encounters are more engaging than in past entries. Like many other areas of the design, the Wonder Power was a great way to facilitate these gameplay elements. It ties the mechanical aspect of the bosses into the aesthetics of the Wonder Flowers, which can go a long way towards helping players feel that the gameplay and visuals are working together towards a common goal. New to this game, there are open areas in which the player can run around and select the levels within in any order they so desire. These areas are often gated off by a barrier that needs to be broken with a certain amount of Wonder Seeds. The player is free to play any amount of levels in this area, as long as they obtain enough seeds to progress. This is very similar to the systems present in the 3D Mario series. In many of these games, areas and levels are gated by certain collectible requirements. Examples of this would be the stars required to open doors in Super Mario 64, and the stars required to discover galaxies in Super Mario Galaxy. Super Mario Odyssey is more of a collectathon than these other two, but even it has requirements for being able to progress to the next kingdom. For Wonder, this represents a push in that general direction for the design as a whole, where the mid-level collectibles are almost as important as finishing the stage itself. While the main focus is still to reach the end of the areas and defeat the castles, and by extension, reach the ends of levels, the ways in which a player can do so have been greatly expanded. There are a huge number of different routes and sequences of stages the player can go through to clear an area. Two main reasons exist for why these open areas are as well integrated as they are. The first is that it helps to impart a grand sense of adventure moving throughout the world. Having a choice in the matter of direction to take can improve the feeling of discovery that comes associated with exploring. This series is generally more focused on its more gamic elements than anything else, but Wonder does some good at expanding the focus out to a broader, more experience-driven exploration. The second is that it facilitates the difficulty system and contributes towards its functionality. As another series first, each stage has a difficulty rating, ranging from 1 to 5. My first concern with these indicators was that they wouldn't be accurate representations of the actual challenge provided. Thankfully, each level's ranking turned out to be fairly accurate. The easiest stages are given 1 star, and are usually on the shorter side and almost entirely devoid of roadblocks. In the 2 and 3 star range, levels have a reasonable amount of threats, and generally require a bit more out of the player than the easiest ones. More experienced players may begin to feel the difficulty with 4-star stages, where the number of threats and skill needed to overcome the obstacles becomes higher. 4 stars is also where levels will start to have a significant number of threats that will instantly kill the player, as opposed to damaging them or merely setting them back. 5-star ratings are reserved for the Special World and the final fight against Bowser, and are specifically meant to be very hard to best. These stages frequently require skillful execution, tight timing, and fast thinking. For many seasoned Mario players, these levels may not be as challenging as intended, but it's hard to complain considering that Wonder offers some of the hardest platforming for the Mario games in a long time. The last level in the Special World is probably the hardest level in series history, so complaining that the game isn't as difficult as I wish it would be seems a tad unfair. This difficulty system means that the game can accommodate a very large range of potential skill. Younger players will be able to play the easier stages, earning enough Wonder Seeds to advance to the next world. More competent players are also taken care of, with the areas often having branching paths that allow a skilled player to play levels that are more fitting to their abilities. This allows Wonder to cater to a larger potential player base, without sacrificing any potential difficulty to get there. Normally, I would be the first to argue that committing to a more closed, linear setup can be massively beneficial for the developers. Its biggest advantage is that it absolutely guarantees that the game's parts will need to be completed in a set order. The list of benefits from this is long, with some of the more notable ones being a much greater amount of control over the experience as a whole, an ability to design difficult challenges with the expectation that a player will have completed simpler trials earlier on, and an insurance against players potentially getting lost or misled as to what the next step should be. Considering how well realized this new system of open areas is, however, I can't really fault the new non-linearity that Wonder brings to the table. For the reasons stated before, I think that this system is very strongly implemented, and adds a good deal to Wonder's gameplay. Each world also contains a variety of enemies, threats, and different ways the player can move through the levels. Our first world, Pipe Rock Plateau, is a bit of a break from series tradition in terms of its presentation. While the tutorial section the area starts out with has a gentle, hilly aesthetic, Like most World 1s in the Mario games, the main bulk of its levels take place in a collection of clearings surrounded by mountainous terrain. Many of the in-game levels still maintain the look of a plains area, but the world map is much different than the norm. This makes sense when looking at the arrangement of the worlds. Each of the different areas surround the Petal Islands in the center, ringing it in with less flat terrain, so this change fits the design of Wonder's map. As for levels, World 1 has the standard variety you would expect of the beginning portions of any 2D Mario game. Flat ground and platforms, with few pits that can make the player instantly lose a life, are the most common type of level present. Talking about enemy variety, all the old stand-ins are here, like Goombas, Koopas, Piranha Plants, and others. There are also quite a few new enemy types introduced. One that shows up a few times is the charging Rhino enemies. When they sight the player, they will wind up and start charging, not stopping until they collide with a solid wall. There is plenty to praise here, with the most obvious thing being their integration into the level design. Rhinos don't just harm the player, they can be used to gain access to otherwise sealed off areas. Levels with them are often designed to create complicated scenarios, where the player will have to think before aggravating a Rhino. The game squeezes a lot of juice out of this particular enemy in this way. Take the first level they're introduced. It has an establishment of concept, complication of concept, subversion of concept, and a complication of the subversion. A classic example of good mechanical depth and integration, and all within the same level, adding to the snappy pacing. While there aren't too many other very notable enemies present in the first world, this is understandable, as the designers were probably focused on trying to get players familiar without throwing too much new information at them in a small time frame. Ignoring the special world, the Petal Isles are the second location the player will enter, but they won't be the second area that will be completed. Wonder's world map is designed like a flower, with each of the differing worlds radiating outwards from the central Petal Isles. After each world, the player will need to progress around the isles to the next area, moving in a clockwise direction. This means each section of the isles will be completed at a different time, where the player will be constantly advancing through disparate areas, which, like the open areas, contributes towards a sense of discovery and adventure. The Petal Isles contain the majority of the game's water levels. These stages have a tendency to be many players' least favorite parts of these games, so it was a smart decision to split up the world containing the majority of them into multiple parts. In previous games, the tropical worlds had to be completed before the player could move on, which would often mean back-to-back water levels until they were through. In Wonder, the multi-part setup of this world means that the water stages are spread throughout the playtime, which can reduce fatigue and help to make these stages feel like a refreshing change of pace, as opposed to an annoying, repetitive, unpopular roadblock. As you might expect, this world is full of enemies which only inhabit aquatic homes. My personal favorite of these is the giant flounder enemies. These will move around under the surface of the waterbed, and will lunge out when they spot Mario swimming above. They force the player to keep moving, lest they get snapped by the flounder. There are also these kingfisher-type enemies, which will dive into the water from the air, swim in an arc back to the surface, then reset and wait for the player again. It seems like a good idea to combine both water and non-water movement types in this way, as there has really never been an enemy that incentivizes a player to use both systems of locomotion to defeat it, which is both unique from a gameplay perspective and memorable from a player perspective. The second world, Fluff Puff Peaks, is a combination of the kinds of cloud and snow worlds seen in the past. Some levels are blanketed by layers of ice and snow, and some are less chilly, with puffy, friendly clouds. Both stages have similar color palettes, with the world as a whole using shades of blue, purple, and pink frequently. It also makes sense for a tall mountain area to contain both sky levels and snow levels, so combining these two concepts into one makes sense for a game with one less world than is normally present. While stages in Pipe Rock Plateau tend to be more flat, stages in Fluff Puff Peaks introduce some verticality into the level design. While the goal is generally still to get to the flag at the right side of the level, secrets, hidden areas, and other paths towards the finish are accessible in some stages by moving up or down. Climbing platforms is much more common here than in previous levels, as well as a significantly higher count of bottomless pits that the player can fall into. Outmaways, a new enemy, are used here as well. Objects in their path get kicked, and levels are designed to have ice blocks that the Outmaways can knock away to threaten the player. Some scenarios with them can test the player's ability to dodge the ice blocks, while others have the player use the enemy's anger to their benefit, riding the block to get to where they need to go. Moving forward after World 2, the third world, Shining Falls, presents a path of challenge the player will advance through, spurred on by Master Poplin. He wants to test Mario's strength before he hands over his Royal Seed, which is sort of cute as a story beat, but also results in a lack of a castle to overcome at the finale of the journey. Where you might expect to have a boss to beat, Master Poplin just gives the player the Royal Seed at the end of the world, which is unique, but certainly anticlimactic, and doesn't really add anything besides its inherent originality. One of the few instances where a focus on creating a new, unexpected experience hampers Mario Wonder rather than helping it. Overall, the stages in Shining Falls represent a push towards greater challenge, like Fluff Puff Peaks before it. It includes fewer deadly drops than the previous world, but compensates by including a variety of dangerous new obstacles that can be threatening if Mario isn't careful. My favorite new addition in this area is the Hoppycat enemies. While they don't move on their own, they will jump when they see Mario jump, which means the player will need to be careful lest they leap themselves into taking damage. The first encounter with these critters very smartly sets up this idea, with Hoppycats consecutively leaping up from lower platforms, effectively teaching the player about how they work and how to avoid them. Another stage has the player ride a hollow, moving platform with a Hoppycat tucked inside. Jumping will cause the creature to shoot out the front, breaking blocks and damaging enemies. The way this works is very intuitive, and another one of the many ways Mario Wonder incorporates unique gameplay into regular areas, not just the Wonder Flower sections. This time, the Hoppycat is a boon to the player, not a bane, and will need to be used effectively to grab items and collectibles while on the ride. It can even be killed or lost, further deepening the strategy required to utilize it to its fullest. After the third world, the game becomes a touch less linear. Worlds 4, 5, and 6 are not required to be completed in a set order, and can be strung together however you so wish. The player has had a decent degree of freedom in how to progress through each individual world, and now those liberties are applied at a more macro scale for the latter half of the game. Although these remaining 3 can be completed in any order, we'll cover each of them in the order they are presented in. World 4, Sun-Baked Desert, takes a very unique approach towards building an interesting challenge for the player to overcome while in the overworld. Where the previous areas were more concerned with presenting the standard sorts of obstacles that you would expect from a Mario game, Sun-Baked Desert takes a turn with the introduction of a very large amount of world map puzzles. World 4 starts off with the game's biggest open area, with a full half of the levels present here, giving a huge amount of level variety present right off the bat. Here's the catch. Most of these levels are hidden away from immediate view, and must be found by looking around the environment. It's important to point out that most of these stages are fairly easy to find. Many are fairly obvious, especially the ones hidden in the illusions, which are possible to accidentally stumble across when moving through this wide, flat desert part of the area. I don't think that this is an issue though, both because of the younger intended audience, and because it only takes a small commitment to a theme to diversify an area from the norm. And this is achieved here, even if the puzzle elements aren't very challenging. This section also has the largest degree of freedom in what order the player wishes to complete stages in. This is due in large part to the sizable open area at the entrance, but there are also 2 main routes the player can reach the world's castle through, which adds to the already impressive non-linearity. The mummy enemies introduced here are both a great fit for the desert aesthetic and interesting mechanically. Using the pulling cords that have already been introduced in previous levels as a way to defeat an enemy is a great way to get a lot of mileage out of the mechanic. It's also very pleasing how the mummy unravels as you pull, adding to this silly, cartoony atmosphere. World 5, the Fungi Mines, features a large amount of underground levels. While underground stages in previous titles were often dark, gray, and trended towards providing an isolated feeling, the caves and caverns in Wonder offer a far more vibrant atmosphere. They often include bright shades of green and purple, and generally have well-lit backgrounds, which doesn't box the player in as much as in previous games. Levels here often have a roof, which can cramp the space somewhat, but it isn't nearly as oppressive as before. One of the best inclusions for threats in this section is the hanging vine enemies. Dropping spiked seeds on the player from above, it can be grabbed onto and pulled to defeat it, similar to the mummies. However, being that they are on the ceiling, dropping with the vine will yank the player back up like a bungee cord, which can be used as a boost to get to areas that are otherwise unreachable. These are utilized very effectively in the level design, where they often act as a dangerous tool that the player has one chance to use to their advantage. This is my personal favorite of the new enemies, as it is both fun to use on its own and interestingly combined with the layout of the stages to provide a good experience. Fake door enemies are also introduced in the ghost house of this area, which is also the only haunted level in the game. They look just like regular entrances to other areas, but will move towards the player when activated by getting too close. Tricky threats like this are a staple of the sorts of haunted houses that have been present since Mario World, and these are utilized the best in sections with many other doors, where the player needs to figure out which ones are real and which ones are fake. Deep Magma Bog, our sixth world, has a volcano aesthetic, and is filled with hues of red and orange. Like World 4, it contains many different ways to progress through its content, but unlike Sunbaked Desert, it doesn't have an open area that allows the player to access many levels at once. Instead, it contains many separate linear paths that diverge and converge with each other, branching off and joining back up with another route later on. Differentiating this area's progression from previous ways the game has allowed the player this choice was a good idea to separate the different sections of the game thematically and mechanically. As you might expect from the visual design, many stages in our sixth world contain lava that will instantly KO the player when touched. Deep Magma Bog contains the largest amount of immediately deadly threats because of this, where even standard, lower difficulty levels have many ways to end the player on the spot when they make a mistake. Besides that, there are a larger than normal amount of environmental threats, like the burning hot rocks and the flame wheels, that the player will need to avoid when navigating stages in the area. I've mentioned them before, so it will probably be of little surprise that the Rumbas are the best new creature in this part. When sighting the player, they will roll forward and attempt to knock into them. They are impervious to most normal methods of assault, but the drill can take them out in a hurry when used properly. As expected, they only appear in levels with the drill included, and can act as a more severe threat to players without that specific advantage. After each world's royal seat has been claimed, the player can go and challenge Bowser. While the stages leading up to the final confrontation don't have a whole lot of notable new inclusions for the series, there is one element introduced that I hope to see revisited in future games: Missile Megs. Like Bullet Bills, they will fly forward and damage the player on hit, but unlike their smaller cousins, they can be stood on top of when jumped on, as opposed to bounced off of, and act as a temporary platform that moves across the screen. As they slowly start to lose altitude after being defeated, timing your jumps across a series of them can be an interesting exercise, not to mention how they can act as platforms individually to reach an otherwise out-of-reach location. The Special World exists as a reward for players discovering certain secret exits. Each world has a way to enter it, bringing us to a total of 10 Special World levels. The extra 3 come in the form of challenge levels that are unlocked after collecting enough Wonder Seeds here. This means the Special World has the seeds very well implemented into its design. Each level in this area is gatekept by a hidden flagpole in another world. A player has to discover enough entrances scattered throughout the game to be able to attempt these harder levels, pushing players to explore and rewarding a dedication to doing so. As for level composition, the Special World's makeup is a mix of everything found in the stage's respective worlds. You can find design pieces from Pipe Rock Plateau in the first world's special level, things from the second world in the Fluff Puff Peaks level, and so on. It makes sense to keep the design elements consistent so as to keep the impression that this is an adventure the player is undertaking. Later, the levels incorporate designs from all areas of the game, testing the player on everything they have encountered up to that point. It should also come as no surprise that the Special World represents a significant step up in difficulty as compared to most standard stages. Levels here often include many ways that the player can fail in a single hit, be it a bottomless pit or another deadly trap. Precision and tight timing are also very important for these stages, where a single misinput or mistake can spell death. This is ramped up even further with the challenge stages. Earlier, I claimed that the final stage in the Special World, the final test badge marathon, is probably the hardest stage in the entire series, and I wasn't being hyperbolic. The player has to run the gauntlet of very difficult badge challenge sections, where every action and expert badge is tested. Not only is it very long, it also requires very un-Nintendo-like levels of precision in certain sections. The spring jump piece is my pick for the hardest part in any Mario game I've played. The final stretch of that section just looks absurd when you first see it, and it requires a large amount of trial and error to overcome. Failure will send the player back a checkpoint 3 challenges back, so the player needs to make it to this section through other hard areas just to attempt it again. A huge ramp up in difficulty from everything else the game throws at you, and yet very rewarding to finally conquer. The game is able to have this sort of extreme challenge because it's safely tucked away where only veteran players will be able to reach it, and not where it would cause rookies any undue frustration. Overall, Mario Wonder sports a very stylized, artistic presentation. I know that's something that can be said about every game in this series, but this game in particular is very keen to push its most cartoonish elements to the top. It's really a feast for the eyes, with heaps and heaps of vibrant details. Just looking at the game in action is very enjoyable, as I'm sure has been shown thoroughly throughout this review. One of the strongest pieces of the visuals is the use of color. While the specific applications of color may seem strange at points, the combinations of shades and tones can really make the designs pop. Colors seem to be specifically chosen to form a strong color palette, as opposed to more traditional shades you might expect from some elements. Grass, rock, sky, and other textures are frequently tinted non-standard or unrealistic shades to complement the other colors in the area. In previous titles and series, like the new Super Mario Bros games especially, the designers succeeded in presenting a very cheerful and upbeat environment using bright colors, but often failed at making the colors mesh together such that they complemented each other. There are areas where this is done well, but they are the exception, not the rule. Mario Wonder improves in this regard by having excellent color in all of its areas, not just a few select ones. Each of Mario Wonder's 8 worlds and sections have a unique color palette as well, which both adds to the uniqueness of the individual worlds as well as helping the sense of moving along through diverse biomes and sections of the game. Additionally, there are tons of tiny details throughout the animation that help contribute to a delightful atmosphere past what was present in the series' history. Elevating the artistic design above the limits of previous entries was a good choice for many reasons, but a couple stick out as major contributors towards this decision. The first is a meta reason, that being the reception of the past few games in the 2D series. The new Super Mario Bros entries have had many things said about them, and original generally isn't one of them. New Super Wii in 2009 solidified the visual ideas set by the first New Super game on the DS, and these games have maintained a very consistent art style since. This would be fine, except that the New Super games have been the only entries in the 2D Mario series since 2006. These games have had plenty of time to get stale when they have a very simplistic and straightforward style to begin with, when the 3D series has only gotten more diverse with time, and when the designers seem dead set on doubling and tripling down on the visuals with every release, seemingly unwilling to consider the kinds of stylistic changes going on in the 3D games. People had been ready for a breath of fresh air for years and years when Wonder was starting development. So it makes complete sense that the designers would want to wow people by injecting some new life into the visuals. However, I think it's fair to say that Nintendo didn't want this style only because of how previous games have been received. Reputations like this will fade with time, and the game will remain constant, meaning any choice that is to remain timeless has to stand on its own, rather than solely being a response to cultural trends. The other big reason this design choice is so effective is because it complements the mechanical elements of the game quite nicely, with the Wonder Flower being the biggest example. With all the wacky changes in gameplay going on throughout, it makes sense that the visuals would follow suit. The shift towards an over-the-top, silly style better complements the over-the-top, silly gameplay. If the visuals were more in the style of previous 2D titles, it might be a bit more jarring to switch between normal play and the various flower gameplay present throughout. It helps the gameplay flow smoothly from one stylized scenario to the next, just as how Mario Odyssey's visual style helped keep clarity intact when using its central mechanic, Cappy. I'd say that Wonder is better than Odyssey in this regard, with even more care put into making the visuals match the gameplay, which shows that the team at Nintendo took some lessons they had learned from designing that game forward into future projects. One part of the aesthetics doesn't rise up to the standards set by the rest of the game, however, the talking flowers. As Mario passes by, they will chime in with a quip, a joke, or some form of pun. To put it tactfully, the flowers can often intrude on the player in a very unwelcome way, as their quotes are usually relegated to pointing out the obvious or making some sort of forced joke. To put it bluntly, they're annoying. Their quotes are surface deep, which leads to them being unfunny, and can be pretty frustrating for someone just trying to enjoy their Mario game. Mercifully, they can be turned off in the audio options. I ended up disabling them in my first playthrough after only about 10 minutes. Less visual clutter seems to have been a large priority with the design of many aspects of this game. One of the ways this manifests is the much more simple and sparse in-game UI. The only indicators shown are the player's stored power-ups, lives, and both types of coins. Wonder Seeds and 10 Flower coins are both hidden at base, freeing up a larger amount of the screen's real estate for much more of the beautifully realized aesthetic design. While I do like how this looks, it must be pointed out that this obscures the most important bits of the player's collectibles from view. The player has to pause to take a look at what they have gotten so far, which disrupts the flow of the game and takes a small but relevant amount of time, whereas previously all it took was a glance to see what you were missing. It seems like the developers could have included some visual indicator in the top right or top left that would have been unobtrusive enough to not be annoying. Even if the creators felt that it was important to simplify the UI in this way, the same logic used to justify the hiding of the collectibles can be applied to the other elements of the design that remain. It's likely that the 10 flower coins are actually the most important information for the player to have instant access to. Coins and lives are far too individually insignificant to matter in the moment, while collectibles are something the player will want to be able to know what they have and what they don't at a glance. The game does provide a pop-up to show which collectible was obtained whenever the player grabs one, but it wouldn't have been hard at all to put a small indicator under the other information that is already present in the UI. Just 3 small dots would have been enough to improve the readability of the information without sacrificing the appearance of the visuals. In my previous Super Mario World analysis, I went into some amount of detail regarding that game's music, going into each track individually. While I do want to talk about Wonder's soundtrack, I don't have a whole lot to say about each song in isolation. I'm going to change it up a bit here and discuss the generalities of the music as a whole, especially compared to series trends. While Mario Wonder contains an abundance of the sorts of melodies that you would expect from the series, its composition stands in contrast to past games. Many Mario titles feature the sorts of synthetic bleeps and bloops that you would expect from video games, both past and present. While the series has strayed away from this style more and more as the years have gone on, with the 3D games as a whole going in an entirely different musical direction than their two-dimensional counterparts, computer-generated synths have always remained an important part of Nintendo's wheelhouse. With Mario Wonder, many of these synthesized sounds have become less common, in favor of more standard instruments like the piano and guitar. While synthetic instrumentation remains present in Wonder, especially in bosses and other high-intensity moments, it often takes a backseat to elements like the guitar and piano. This is especially true of the simple level songs that accompany the majority of stages in the game. The feeling of this new musical direction is a bit harder to pinpoint and describe than usual, but I think that the best word for it is personal. The guitar is a major player in many of Wonder's tracks, with a gentle approach that is reminiscent of the sorts of simple and naturalistic tunes that one could be expected to hear in a very casual setting. Humble would be another way to describe it. While synthesized melodies can absolutely pull off relaxing moods like instruments can, the difference here is in the mixing of the tracks. For demonstration, here's a comparison of the overworld theme in New Super Wii and Mario Wonder. Both of these songs are exceptional, and elevate their accompanying gameplay wonderfully, but it's undeniable that both are going for different moods. One of the ways Wonder's track includes a naturalistic feel is with the spacing of the elements in the mixing. The synthesized lead in Wii's music is pushed onto the listener directly because of a very frontal mixing, where it takes up a large part of the song's range. In contrast, the pieces of Wonder's track feel like there is some amount of distance or separation between them, both in space and melodic scale, which give a very open feel to the composition, which in turn helps that natural sensibility. Naturalistic instrumentation is also present to a degree in New Super Wii, as you may have heard from the clip I played. The new Soup games are themselves evolutions from an even more synth-driven style present in games from the NES, SNES, and Game Boy eras. In that way, Mario Wonder represents a farther distance traveled down this path, in the same way that orchestra and big band-driven compositions became more and more prevalent in the 3D Mario titles. Like other games in the series past, dynamic elements in the music are implemented to give specific gameplay segments a unique feel, which can be applied to tracks depending on the circumstances. With the elephant power-up, brass instruments are added to the arrangements. If the player is burrowed underground with the drill, the track is hit with a low-pass filter, which cuts the top end of the arrangement out of the mix. While underwater, a dampening effect is applied to reduce volume and make it sound like you're hearing it through a surface. Each of these effects are small on their own, but combined with the gameplay, they help to give a greater sense that the game is responding to your movements and is using its music to accentuate the visual more clearly. A very naturalistic timbre seems to have been a priority not only in the soundtrack, but also in the sound design. In my Mario World video, I talked about how an increased emphasis on the tonality and timbre of the effects compared to previous entries resulted in a more fitting sonic composition. That same process was undergone again for this game, similar to how the musical style has evolved over time. Nintendo has always been good at adding fitting and purposeful sound effects to their games, and Mario Wonder is no exception. The effects fit just as well as they do in any other Mario game. I think that one of the more interesting decisions with this game's sound design comes in the form of instrumental sound effects. Many of the effects in this game are actually instruments being played. One of the best examples of this is the ground pound. New to this game, a drum roll will play when the player initiates a ground pound, and will stop when the player hits a surface. This adds some amount of anticipation to the action, a build-up, and that tension is released when the player hits the ground. It's silly, cartoonish, and perfectly accentuates the action and the game's over-the-top aesthetics. The jump sound is slightly different in this game as well, compared to previous outings. It has the texture of a stringed instrument, like a guitar or violin being plucked. The noise of power-ups being knocked out of a block is that of a clarinet or other woodwind. I'm glad that the musical effects stretch beyond just a few examples. It gives the game's effects a singular sound, which helps the visuals and gameplay enchant the player more than they may have already. It's easier to be drawn into an experience when many different sound effects are working together towards that goal. Another way the instrumental sounds help is that they can prevent the effects and music from clashing when played back together. While watching the aforementioned Mario World video, one of my friends remarked that the jump sound effect was beginning to grate on him. It was the first time that I had considered that the effects and the music usually operate with disparate sonic profiles. In Wonder, the sound effects mesh extremely well into whatever music they are played alongside, and I now understand that this is because of their shared instrumentality. Super Mario Bros. Wonder, at its core, is a game of innovation. One of its main goals is to separate itself from some of the gameplay and visual tropes present in the series' past. At that, it does a great job, and manages to present a very original experience for a Mario title. But it's not just good as a unique experience, it's a good game in its own right. Platforming isn't just based around the new elements that have been added into the formula. It succeeds on its own, with well-designed situations throughout the game. The new enemies aren't only designed to be mechanical gimmicks, they also add a lot to the gameplay in conjunction with the other elements. The Wonder Flower system is not only refreshing, but implemented in such a way that it complements the level design, and vice versa. It's innovation without sacrificing the advantages of the existing concepts present in every game in the series. Mario Wonder builds on top of them and provides twists on them, while preserving their strengths, and for that, it deserves a significant amount of praise. However, there is a catch to all this goodness. Moving forward, it will be extremely hard for the developers to create a new title that will wow players in the same way Wonder did. With the sheer variety and scope of gameplay on offer here, I have a hard time believing that a brand new 2D Mario game will be able to live up to the standards set, in terms of how it surprises players and expands the series. If the developers decide to keep this style of design for their next game, it won't hit as hard or be as refreshing as the first release. If they dial it back, it would be seen as a regression to a lesser formula, whether that is accurate or not. Ramping it up farther is also problematic, as it would require even more developmental resources, not to mention that it would set an unfortunate, unrealistic expectation for what direction players expect the series to advance in. It would be wise to remember that Mario Wonder is a good game on its own, and I can't imagine that the next release will be poorly designed even if it isn't quite what everyone expected, but many others in the player base won't see it that way. Fortunately, this is a bridge that can be crossed at a later time. After all, what we have now is great.
And we all lived happily ever after. Come back again sometime, yeah?